at Grey Roots Museum and Archives. Again, thank everybody for coming here. We're going to talk about the Cinderella campaign. Could you just elaborate a bit, Mark, on sort of where that name even comes from?
It comes from that after the Battle of Normandy, the Canadians started. We got the assignment of going up the left coast, the left flank of the entire Allied army, which then put us on the coast of France and Belgium and ultimately into Holland. And as we were moving north and fighting different battles and things like operations, sieges on cities and the port cities. The Canadians also realized that they were at the absolute bottom of the supply stream. So the huge amount of supplies going to the Americans because they kept their supplies to themselves. The British were taking all the supplies that should have been to the Commonwealth forces. They were taking the priority for themselves in getting ready for Operation Market Garden, the bridge too far. And so as a result of being at the low end of the supply chain, people started looking back at the tale of Cinderella, always never invited to the party, but left to do all the dirty work. Because that was the other thing. The Canadians were facing really the hardest fighting in September of 1944, much harder than what the Americans were facing. They actually didn't face a lot of fighting at all there. So they're sort of romping their way to Paris. The British are going up the center, heading for Antwerp and liberating Brussels, and lots of thousands of people waving and throwing flags and stuff. And the Canadians are fighting bitter battles to get across one river after another on the
Right.
coastal plain. And so that was, where they got the idea. And so they became known as the Cinderella Army. Some historians have then called them the Cinderella Army right through to the end of the war. And I think that's not accurate.
Right.
So that's where I got into, really was this campaign, the campaign to clear the Channel ports and take them up to the Scheldt estuary, where the supplies start to flow again in the
Right.
fighting for the Scheldt estuary. So I decided to call it the Cinderella Campaign because it's more one campaign than the Army's identity
Right.
for the
Right.
rest of the war.
Right. And I'm sure the soldiers themselves, almost like how those in Italy took almost a bit of pride in being D-Day Dodgers in Italy. I'm sure they took a bit of pride in being the Cinderella army of the Allies. So, Mark,
Exactly.
if we rewind a little bit, then, so we go back to June
Mm.
6th, we have Canadian Third Division comes ashore in Normandy. They're joined in July by the Second Division. At what point do we sort of transition from two Canadian divisions fighting in Normandy to First Canadian Army in Normandy?
It's an interesting backstory here because the first Canadian Army commander was General Harry Crerar, and General General at that point becomes Field Marshal a little later. Bernard Montgomery can't stand Crerar. He totally dislikes the man. He thinks he's incompetent, but he has a huge respect for the commander of the Second Canadian Corps, which is Lieutenant General Guy Simonds. He actually considered Simonds to be a bit of a protege of himself. And so we come in with the third division, then second corps comes in with Guy Simonds commanding, as you said, second division, third division, and then a little later the fourth Canadian Armored Division comes in, and so he's kind of commanding all three divisions. And Crerar keeps sort of saying, well, it's time for me to come to France. And Montgomery says, oh, no, no, there's not quite room for you yet. And so it's not until quite late in July that Montgomery can't keep pushing this back, and Crerar arrives. And so it's a difficult thing for Crerar because the Battle of Normandy is winding down by the time he gets on the ground. So he plays no significant role in the entire Battle of Normandy. So now when we start moving up the coast, heading towards Belgium and via the ports of Le Havre, Dunkirk, Dieppe, Boulogne, Calais, he is in command. but it's kind of an awkward thing because the operations and the way they unfold, an army commander doesn't have much control over anything because most of it's individual divisions being hived off to take, like we take the first British Corps is given the task of taking Le Havre. Um, so Crerar can't really do anything there. It's really the corps commander who's going to do it. And then as we go up further, it's actually divisional commanders because one division's left behind at each of these ports to
Okay.
clear them. So that's kind of the backstory there. So First Canadian Army exists, but it's really more as it pretty much exists as a logistical train and maintaining the contact points between itself and the British Army, the Air Force Bomber Command support, naval support from off the coast, things like that. So it is playing a role, but not directing the day-to-day fighting in the same way as would be the case when you get further north and have the Scheldt Estuary battles and the Rhineland battle.
Okay. Well, that's very interesting, just how that all does sort of break down
Mm-hmm.
differently on paper as it did in the field, obviously. So we have the Canadians, we have the Allies in Normandy, and they fought a brutal campaign in Normandy.
Mm-hmm.
So once we break out of Normandy, the Germans seem to be pretty much defeated. And what's really stopping the Allies at that point? How come they just don't basically drive right on to Berlin at that point?
Well, the big problem is logistics, the supply train. So the Americans break out, and General George Patton leads the charge where they race across really wide open interior France to Paris, and they get there really quick and take Paris fast. And then they move north towards the German border, but they start to run out of steam because there's not the amount of fuel and supplies and everything like that. British are in a similar state. They are moving north. They get into Belgium. They take Brussels, liberate that, and they ultimately end up in Antwerp on September 4th, I believe. And then same thing, they kind of are running out of steam. And also Montgomery's launched his plan for Operation Market Garden, which is going to be the big offensive that is going to win the war before Christmas. And we're always winning wars before Christmas, but not actually seceding.
Right.
It's sort of an ongoing thing in military history. And the Canadians, on the other hand, we were facing quite stiff fighting because the German 15th Army came out of Normandy still relatively intact. They got out through the Falaise Gap, and then they start moving up towards Holland. And they're very disorganized, but they're still a coherent, cohesive, like largely cohesive fighting power. And
Okay.
so they keep fighting these fighting withdrawals against the Canadians, and we have to keep pushing up against them. So our situation is quite different, and that's where the Cinderella Army comes in again, because the other guys aren't really doing much fighting, but we are, and we're
Right.
not getting and we're not getting the supplies
Right.
to make it possible. There are actually a couple times when the Canadian artillery, for example, ran out of shells.
Wow.
And we're just having to wait until the ammunition got forward. And you can't do much in the way of supporting your infantry, if your guns can't fire. And so it was that kind of a problem. And because all of the supplies are still coming, every last bit of material coming into the Allies is coming across the beaches at Normandy.
Okay.
So we have to take a freighter, and you have to unload that freighter into landing craft, and they bring it into the beach. Then you have to drag all this stuff up the beach and get it into trucks and start heading up to where the Allied, the sharp end of the great armies that are
Right.
advancing is. And the Americans, they called theirs the Red Ball Express. The Canadians and British had a similar one going. They were like a 24-hour operation. Trucks just nose to tail going up one road, unloading at supply depots, turning around, coming down another road so that they weren't impeding each other. And
Right.
they just did this 24 hours a day after day after day, to
Wow.
try and keep that supply chain going. And the problem you have is, of course, the sharp end is moving further and further and further away from Normandy. So everything is being having to be trucked every day. You're trucking further than you were the day before. So
Right.
it's not really a sustainable situation. And that's where the port of Antwerp became so important, because it's the biggest port in World War II. It was the biggest port in Europe.
Okay.
And if you can open that up to shipping, you you solve this problem, because it's up on the Dutch Belgian border. So you're
Right.
right up where the action is happening. And in the meantime, the Allies want these smaller ports like Le Havre, Boulogne, Calais taken by the Canadians, so that they can be opened up to shipping and at least provide a little more little closer, some port facilities that should make emptying the ships easier. And that's why the coastal port clearing operations of Cinderella Campaign occur.
Okay. And of course, the Germans are not too eager to let those ports fall into Allied hands either.
Yeah, exactly. And so they had turned each of these ports into a fortress,
Right.
and they had a garrison there whose job was to defend that port. And Hitler viewed this as very important. And so he issued orders that they were supposed to defend the ports to the death. In the end, none of them do this.
Right.
You know,
Right.
there, there's a certain pragmatism amongst the commanders of these ports, and they fight until it obviously is untenable, and then
Right.
they surrender. But we do have some really really tough fighting to get through, because they've been fortifying these places ever since they took them in
Okay.
1940.
So they've
So
had a bit of time.
you had 4 years to put this thing together.
Right.
Um, and so initially they you know concentrated on the coastal side of the cities, fortifying that, because they thought they would get attacked from the sea. Then
Right.
they start realizing, well, no, it's probably more that they're going to get attacked from the land, from inland. So then they started building, basically surrounding the
Okay.
city with a fortress of works. Lots of guns, lots of bunkers, pretty extensive stuff. It's interesting when we take our tourists through there. There's a lot of these bunkers still existing, because they're
Wow.
huge. So everyone just sort of, at the end of the war, they couldn't figure out what to do with them, so they just left them,
Just left. Yeah.
and and they just sit there. There's one behind up above a hardware store in Calais, and so
Wow.
it just sort of sits there. And
Wow. It's funny when you mention about all those fortifications that my thoughts go right back to the shell shortages and limitations. Like, how do you attack that when you don't have supplies? Like, so. Mark, if we go back just a little bit,
Mhm.
just for some people that might not be fully understand market garden. When we talk about market garden, what are we talking about here?
So Montgomery's idea, and it's a pretty bold, it's interesting. The Americans always, and American historians particularly, um, always chastise Montgomery for being too cautious. And yet he could be quite adventurous, and think outside of the box. And so he came up with the way to win the war, now that they've broken out of Normandy, was to go into an advance that would push this narrow wedge of forces up through a number of cities in Holland, particularly Nijmegen and that, to ultimately reach a city called Arnhem, which is on the north side of the Rhine River. And from there, they would be able to push right into Germany's heartland, the industrial heartland of the Ruhr Valley, and carry on to Berlin and win the war. And so
Before
that's
Christmas.
Yeah, before Christmas. And so that's really in a nutshell what it was. And so
Okay.
in order to carry the infantry, the tanks and infantry of 30th British Corps under a very good general called Brian Horrocks, he was leading the charge. But there's a series of bridges, about four bridges across different rivers, that have to be captured intact. And so for that, they carried out airborne parachute drops and glider drops. And it was airborne forces were supposed to seize each bridge, hold them. Then the tanks and the infantry would
Okay.
come, roll across the bridge, carry on to the next one.
Seems
And
like a
there,
sound idea, really.
yeah, yeah, it's got some sound of ideas, and it's very bold.
Yeah.
Um, at this point, we nobody airborne troops are still kind of a novelty. They've been used in Normandy. They were used in Sicily. Um, so they've been used in different times, but people are still trying to learn, okay, what's the survivability time for an unsupported airborne unit? Like how, because they can only bring what they can jump out of a plane with,
Right.
you know,
Right.
and or have it a glider. So, not a lot of supplies, not a lot of munitions. They don't have artillery to any great attempt. They don't have armor. So how long can they survive? And so the timing is really critical. Like that 30th Corps column that's moving towards them has to get there before they run out of
Right.
supplies and steam,
Right.
and the Germans get reorganized and start choking them off. And
Okay.
that's where, there's the classic scene in the film, A Bridge Too Far, where one of the officers, and he actually did say this, it's not even that it got made up. Um, when they were talking about it, he said, I see it working, but I think Arnhem is the bridge too far.
Right. Right.
And it proved to be the case. The British paratroopers that were fighting for Arnhem and the bridge there couldn't hold it, and
Okay.
ultimately they had to be evacuated. And those that successfully evacuated and weren't taken prisoner, most of them were rescued by Canadians, two squadrons of Canadian engineers.
Wow.
And they were working with two squadrons of British engineers. But the British engineers lacked something the Canadians had. We had the Evinrude outboard motor,
Okay.
a Canadian
Okay.
invention. And the
Interesting.
British, the British were rowing.
All right.
And so we were able to go back and forth more quickly. And there's
Right.
a really lovely memorial if anyone ever gets to a place out on the other side, the south side of the River Rhine, near Arnhem. It's called Driel, and there's a lovely memorial to the engineers there. It's actually one of my favorite monuments.
Oh, very interesting. Okay.
Yeah,
That's a really neat side note that probably not a lot of people are aware of, is the act of the engineers there for sure.
yeah.
Was the Canadian Parachute Battalion involved as well?
No, they were the sixth Airborne Division. That division wasn't involved in
Okay.
Market Garden. They were held back because partly they'd been the division that had been dropped into Normandy, and so they'd suffered quite a bit of casualties and were
Right.
rebuilding. But it was also down the road planned that there would be an airborne component to when we would finally break across the Rhine River as an Allied army. And they were being rebuilt and held back to be ready for that one.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Mhm.
So we got Market Garden sort of a side mark. So we're in Normandy. Everybody's advancing towards Germany. What actually happens now with the Canadians as far as attacking these channel ports?
So we initially have a lot of fighting to get to the channel ports because we have to fight up to the River Seine coming out of Paris. And Rouen is the city closest to that, and Le Havre is sort of down at the mouth. Um, and we end up having a really big fight there with the Germans who are withdrawing because it's hard for them to get across the river. So they're holding us in a place called Forêt de Lalande, which is a big forested mountainous kind of little area. And it's also a really interesting place to visit because the battlefield is still intact and you really get a sense of it. And so we're fighting against a couple of SS divisions in there. And the losses are quite heavy because it's really hard. It's dense woods, and so you're moving through dense woods, and the Germans can just sit behind trees and wait for
Right.
you to come and ambush you. And you can't really shoot at them very well because you don't know where they are. You're afraid of dropping the shells on in such a way that they blow up your own guys.
Right.
So it's a tough fight there. We finally get across the river, and then it's really a matter of advancing to each of these cities, the port cities, Le Havre being the first one. And we send the first British Corps that was part of 1st Canadian Army. And they're there with us because 1st Canadian Corps was sent to Italy in 1943 to be part of the advance up through Italy and Sicily initially, and then the Corps comes in and we go forward. So the army has lost half of its Canadians, so it
Right.
needs somebody. So it gets the 1st British Corps attached to it, and the 1st Polish Armored Division become part of 1st Canadian Army. And so the 1st British Corps is assigned to do Le Havre, and we move up, dropping divisions here and there along the coast at Dunkirk. 2nd Division is trying to take Dunkirk. 3rd Division gets Boulogne and Calais. And we can only do one city at a time because there's the division, a British division that has all this incredible equipment that was called the funnies. So they were tanks that had been special. They were created as part of the invasion of Normandy. So there's a tank that's got big chains for bashing up the ground in front of it to detonate mines, and it's called a flail. There's another tank that is basically a flamethrower instead of a gun. There's another tank that has a great big cannon and put in and they took out the normal artillery piece that a tank has, and they put in a great big huge gun that they call the petard.
Okay.
And the shells were kind of the size of a big dustbin. That's what they always
Wow.
described them as. And these were intended to hammer against those bunkers that the Germans had built and smash them open. That was the intention there. So there's all this specialized equipment that you have to wait for, and there's only so much of it. And you use that to get into that city through the fortifications. So the British get it first to use so that they can take Le Havre, and they reduce it. We also, Bomber Command is very involved in this as well because they bomb the cities to try and destroy the German fortifications.
Okay.
And precision bombing is something that nobody knows how to do. So basically, they destroy the city. Le Havre is flattened. And then we sort of learn, well, maybe that's not the best approach. So we start getting
Jeez.
a little more specific on
Right.
what we're trying to do. You go to modern day Le Havre, and there's not an old building to be found.
Wow.
Um, it's just gone. Uh, that happens. We wait for them to actually complete. Um, Dieppe is an interesting one because we take it on September 2nd, and originally, same thing. Dieppe was going to be bombed, but the German garrison there, as the Germans' main force that's withdrawing comes by them, Hitler hasn't yet issued his fight for the city until you die order. That comes about 48 hours later. The commander of Dieppe says, "Hey boys, we're out of here."
Right.
And they hook up with the Germans that are retreating, and they withdraw. And our reconnaissance guys get into Dieppe. in the morning of September 2nd and realize the town is empty of German forces. And they are able to signal Harry Kruger, actually, who at that moment, literally, the bombers back in England are spooling up to come over and destroy Dieppe. And they're able to say, no, no, stand down. And so Dieppe survives and is the beautiful little city it is today as a result. That was a big moment for Canadians as well, of course, because the Canadians at Second Division had been largely annihilated in the raid on Dieppe in August of 1942. So September 1944, Second Division is given the honor of being the ones who can march into Dieppe
Okay.
and liberate the city.
Wow.
And it's a great moment for that division. And meanwhile, Third Division is up trying to take Boulogne and Calais, and those operations take quite a long time. And Second Division, so then what you start seeing is the Canadians start getting sent all over the place because we're that port of Antwerp, we still want to get that open. It's the main port. There's a roughly 72-mile channel called the Scheldt Estuary that runs from Antwerp to the sea, and the Germans control that. So although the British, in about September 2nd, pretty much the same day as Dieppe was liberated, arrived in Antwerp, they've got the town, but it's useless
Right.
until they get the Scheldt Estuary. So Canadian attention, even as we're fighting for these other cities, the Canadian attention is changing and shifting to getting the Scheldt Estuary open.
Okay.
So Second Division and Fourth Canadian Armored Division are about midway through the Channel Port fighting, so late September, are rushed to the Scheldt Estuary area to start fighting and try to open up that port. And then Third Division is left behind to finish the job of opening up Boulogne and Calais
Okay.
and waiting for the funnies to show up at
Right.
each one so that they can do the operation.
Okay. So it's not a
So
straight line advance then. We don't just have
no,
a straight in, right? It's kind of a bit of back and forth going on, really.
yeah, like people are going this way and that way.
Right.
It's and you know again thinking about logistics, you can imagine the logistical nightmare this is for the people who have to control that.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And burning all that precious gas.
yeah, yeah, and so that's kind of there's this overlap that happens between the Scheldt Estuary battle and the conclusion of the Channel Ports fighting.
Okay.
And that's important to remember that because we sort of start fighting in the Scheldt at the end of September, but we're still have a lot of our forces down on the French coast
Okay.
trying to get Boulogne and Calais open.
So
So
there's really no rest at all for the Canadians. They just go from
no,
hard fighting to harder fighting.
yes, that's exactly true.
Yeah.
Third Division, for example, when they take Boulogne, Calais, which was the last city, they take Calais. There's a 24-hour period where they're reorganizing in the city, and then basically they're on trucks heading up to the Scheldt Estuary.
Wow.
And 2 days later, they're in battle again.
Wow.
So yeah, no rest at all. Um,
Incredible logistically, but it must have been very taxing physically for those young men.
yes, and they've taken a lot of casualties. So because they weren't able to rebuild to full strength after the Normandy campaign.
Right.
And then they're losing people as they move their way up the coast. So by the time they arrive at the Scheldt Estuary, all of the Canadian divisions, they're very under strength. And a lot of these guys, have been fighting pretty intense, especially Third Division, because they came ashore June 6,
Right.
1944, and they've been fighting ever since,
Yeah.
and will continue that fight through to the end of November
Jeez.
1944 when the Scheldt Estuary campaign ends.
Yeah, just no rest. It's unbelievable. No wonder battle exhaustion casualties were increasing. And
Yep.
um So, Mark, tell me a little bit about visiting these places today. This sounds like it would be a nice place to visit, if you will, like the northern coast of France in the summer. I'm sure it's a nice
It
tour to go
is.
visit there.
Yes. So the company I work with, Liberation Tours, I've designed it because I wrote the Cinderella campaign. So we've designed actually have a tour that we run kind of 2 year every second year called the Cinderella Campaign Tour. And so we start in Normandy and go up the coast to Dieppe, to Boulogne, to Calais, and then we actually go into the Scheldt Estuary area and over to the Rhineland, and so it's all Second World War. It covers basically the entire Canadian campaign in World War II in Northwest Europe. So it's
Okay.
very similar to the one we run in Italy that covers the Canadian advance in Italy. So very similar tour,
Right.
and it's I really like the tour because the Canadian role in World War II was such that as we've been talking about today, it keeps evolving and changing. And so you're seeing all this incredible landscape, but you're also seeing a battle, a way of fighting and things that keeps evolving and keeps changing. And the Canadian Army gets more and more professional and sophisticated as it goes up
Right.
and does these things, to the point that when we do the Rhineland campaign, um, First Canadian Army was beefed up to the point that by taking resources away from the British Second Army and giving them to the First Canadian Army, that we had over 400,000 troops under Harry Crear's command.
Wow.
It was the biggest army at that point. It's the biggest army that got deployed by the Allies in a single operation.
Wow.
Um, it also the factor that we were trusted to command that speaks a great deal about what Canadians had shown in their ability to do the logistics, because
Right.
logistics is the thing.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and that's where I think Crerar, who's often underestimated by many historians, um, his real strength was logistics. He was extremely good at organizing the movement of troops, the movement of equipment, movement of supplies, and making sure all those pieces are in proper motion.
And I think that tour as well, like when you talked about it, it's very important because when we think of World War II and even Canada's role, we often do just think of the big, Normandy, Dieppe. Like we don't think of the in-between stuff where a lot of young men died, and it's
Yeah.
a very important probably to go on that tour and see some of
Hmm.
those battlefields for sure.
Yeah. And we get to the cemeteries as well. And sometimes
Yeah.
there's cemeteries that people don't really visit that much because they are off the
Yeah.
beaten track. And I think that's really important that, it's the same when we're in Italy. We go to a lot of cemeteries that, just don't, not that many Canadians can get there. And
Yeah. Yeah.
so, you get there and pay your respects to all those young men who are still there.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes it very real. So, Mark, what can we expect from Mark Zuehlke over the next little while?
Well, I'm currently working on a book for the Royal Canadian Artillery Association. I'm one of three authors engaged in that, possibly four. We're talking about bringing another person in. And it's a book called With a Few Guns, and it's about the Canadian artillery personnel and the things they did in Afghanistan through the war there. And so that's taken on a life of its own. It's going on far longer than I expected. But one day I'll be done with that. And then what I'll be working on after that is one I started working on that got derailed by the pandemic because the archives all shut down, so you couldn't do
Mm,
research. And it's on the role that the Canadian Army, Canadian military, I should say, it's not just Army, it'll be Air Force and Navy as well, played in the war against Japan.
okay.
So that's
Okay.
that's that's it. It's tentatively called The Maple Leaf versus the Sun.
Okay. That's a great title. That's pretty well
Thank you.
sums it up right there. Yeah. And that to me actually that sounds a lot like the Cinderella campaign. Really, it's something that's not that thought of when you think of Canada and the Second World War. So I'm sure that'll be a
Mhm.
very well received book.
Yes, well, there's when people think of the war against Japan, they usually just think of the Battle of Hong Kong, which
Yep.
was just a component of it.
Yeah.
There was a
Yeah.
lot of other stuff going on. And so that's why I didn't want to just focus on Hong Kong, although it's the pivotal battle the Canadians fought there.
Right.
But that we also fought in a lot of other places in different roles. And so I wanted to tell those people's story as well.
Yeah. I definitely look forward to that, Mark. And I just want to thank you for taking the time today to talk to us here at Grey Roots. And Mark's going to be live on the screen after this presentation to take your questions.
Thank you.